Hi, welcome to the session where we talk about building user interfaces with Xpress Insight. This is one part of a multi-part series of videos that explain how you can build applications with Xpress Insight. In this video, I'm going to show you how we can use something called as VDL Expressions to build a dynamic user interface. Let's start off by defining what VDL Expressions can do for you. What you've seen in our previous recordings are user interface items like forms and tables, for example. These forms and tables do not react to what a user is doing onto a screen. It's kind of fixed in nature. What VDL Expression lets you do is it lets you create dynamic content in a user interface. One example of this is if you want to show a certain portion of the user interface only if the user has completed some other action on the screen. Another use of VDL Expressions is to programmatically control the layout and data flow in your user interface. One such example is if you want a certain VDL table to be editable only if the user clicks on a particular button. Let's talk a bit about how we can define a VDL expression. Let's talk about how you would define a VDL expression, what a VDL expression looks like. A VDL expression is denoted by an equal sign at the beginning of an attribute value. Let's explore this a bit further by taking a look at an example. I have some VDL over here to generate a VDL table with one column for my entity input. You'll notice I have an editable attribute. The attribute starts with an equal to sign, and this over here after the equal to sign is a VDL expression. You'll notice that this looks like code. What we'll talk about next is the syntax that you will need to use to build VDL expressions. Let's talk about some of the global objects that you have access to use in your VDL expressions. The first global object that you have is the scenario object. The scenario object is the first scenario on the shelf. Within the scenario object, you have access to the entities of that scenario. You also have access to the parameters of that scenario. You also have access to the properties of the scenario object like the scenario name or the scenario ID. You also have access to the scenarios object, which is an array of all the scenarios that you have on the shelf. There's a wars global object which contains all the dynamic variables. And there's also a user global object which has information around the current logged in user. There's a lot that you can do with VDL expressions, but for this session, we're going to talk about two broad use cases. The first one is conditional VDL attributes. Conditional VDL attributes are used to control whether a content in a page is included or not, whether it's hidden or not, whether you want to apply a particular styling to a particular section of the page or not. Here again, I have some VDL to generate a VDL table that has a couple of columns. They should look familiar to you except for this portion on the top where I have a new attribute called as VDL if. The way VDL if works is that the expression is evaluated when the page is loaded. If it evaluates to true, then the tag that it's applied to is visible. So in this case, the VDL if is applied to the VDL table tag. So if it evaluates to true, the VDL table shows, and if not, it doesn't show. Let's take a look at this expression and see what's happening. I have an entity called as enable constraints, and if the value of that enable constraints is true, then I'm going to show this table that has a constraint enable and a constraint limit column. Let's take a look at the user interface to see how it looks. Here I have an entity enable constraints, and if you remember, if the enable constraints was true, then a table would show up. So that's what's happening over here. Based on whether I make this true or false, the table for constraints appear or disappear. This is one of the simple use cases of VDL expressions, how you can modify the layout of your user interface based on certain actions that the user takes on the same user interface. Let's talk about the second interesting use case that you can address with VDL expressions. When building a user interface in Insight, there are cases where you would need to repeat certain blocks of VDL code. One such example is when you want to build multi-scenario views. So say I have a table of inputs, and if I have two scenarios on the shelf, I want to see the input tables for both of these scenarios side by side. Let's again take a look at an example to see how we could do this with VDL expressions. Here I have a VDL table that is going to plot an entity input for me in the user interface. What I'm looking to do is to repeat this table for every scenario that I have on the shelf. To do this, I'm going to take some steps. The first step is to wrap a VDL section around the VDL table that we have over here. The next step is to introduce a new attribute VDL repeat that is going to do the looping for me. The way you define VDL repeat is like writing a for loop in a programming language. you have an array or a set. In this case, I have scenarios. Remember, scenarios is the global object that has a mapping of all the scenarios that you have on the shelf. So I'm essentially writing a for loop for all the scenarios that I have on the shelf. When I specify over here s, I in scenarios, s is the scenario object and I is the position of that scenario object on the shelf. Once I define the VDL repeat over the scenarios global object, I need to apply that to the VDL table that I have within that section. How do I do that? I use an attribute called as scenario and I pass the value I from my VDL repeat loop into it. What does that do? It uses the data from the scenario I to generate that VDL table. Let's take a look at how this looks in the user interface. So notice over here, I have an entity called as input, and that's what I'm plotting on the user interface. And this is how it looks in the user interface. This is the table that I have applied the VDL repeat to. So notice over here, I have one scenario on the shelf. I'm going to put another scenario on the shelf as well. The moment I select another scenario and navigate to the view, you'll notice now I have two tables and they have different inputs. So thinking back on the VDL that we had, I only had one VDL table in my VDL, but now it is dynamic based on the number of scenarios that I have on the shelf. This approach can be used not only to create multi-scenario tables, but it could apply to the entire view as well. You'll also notice that I have some dynamic scenario naming over here. Let's go back and take a look at the VDL to see what I did to enable that. The heading is enabled by the attribute heading that I have over here. The content of the heading attribute is a fixed string input table concatenated by the scenario object.props.name. The first one is VDL conditionals, which lets you change the layout and workflow in your user interface. The second is using VDL repeat to create multi-scenario views. There are a lot more things that you can do with VDL expressions. Let me quickly also show you the documentation before signing off. If this is the first video that you're watching, you can find all of the Express optimization product documentations at this link. The documentation around VDL is under Xpress Insight, and within Xpress Insight there's a section called as VDL Reference. The documentation for VDL is found under the Xpress Insight Help. Within the Xpress Insight Help there is a section called as Insight Developers Guide, and within that you'll find the VDL section which contains VDL expressions. This lists out all of the things that we have talked about today and also a lot more that you can do with VDL expressions. One quick thing I'll mention is that there's also a VDL specific section over here. For example, if I click on VDL table column, you'll notice that it lists out all of the applicable attributes, and to the right of each attribute you'll notice this blue box that says accepts expression. What that means is any attribute that has this box can accept an expression. So over here, remember we used the editable option or the editable attribute, and you'll notice that it says accepts. So for any attribute that has the accepts expression box, you can input a VDL expression in it. Thank you for watching this session. Have a nice day.